bugle answered them. It was just before dawn on April the 25th, 1951, and on a barren hilltop in the Korean wilderness, a young drum major named Philip Buss raised his bugle to his lips and began to play. Not a retreat, not a lament. He played reveille, then the fire call, then every regimental call he could remember, one after another, hurling the brassy notes out across the valley into the cold darkness where thousands of Chinese soldiers were massing for the kill. For 3 days and 3 nights, the men of the 1st Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment, had been swarmed by wave after wave of Chinese infantry blowing bugles and whistles to coordinate their assaults and to fray British nerves. So, when the order came that this single bugle should answer them, should drown out the enemy's signals with the defiant calls of an English county regiment, it was an act of magnificent, almost insane bravado. The Chinese bugles fell momentarily silent, unnerved. But bravado does not stop bullets, and the Gloucesters were now utterly, catastrophically alone. They were perched on Hill 235, a featureless lump of Korean scrub that would soon earn a darker name, Gloucester Hill. Around them, an entire Chinese division, and elements of others, perhaps 10,000 men in total, pressed in from every side. The battalion had started the battle some 700 strong. They were running out of ammunition. They were running out of water. The wounded lay in shallow scrapes, and there was no way to evacuate them because there was no way out. The relief columns sent to break through to them had been smashed and turned back. Headquarters, miles to the rear, had begun to grasp a terrible truth. These men were not going to be saved. How does a single, understrength battalion of British infantry come to be standing alone against 10,000 men, on a hill nobody back home had ever heard of, in a war that Britain had stumbled into almost by accident? How did it come to this? Englishmen from the Cotswolds, from Bristol and Stroud and Cheltenham, dying in their dozens on a hillside 7,000 miles from the Severn. The answer is one of the most extraordinary and most painful episodes in the post-war history of the British Army. It is a story of a stand so stubborn that it bought time measured in lives, time that may have saved Seoul itself. It is a story of a colonel who calmly radioed that his position was a bit sticky whilst his battalion was being annihilated around him. And it is a story that ended not in rescue, but in surrender, captivity, and a long march into the hands of an enemy who would hold British prisoners for 2 long years. This was the Battle of the Imjin River. And the men who fought it would become legends. The men of the Glorious Glosters, holders of a unique American decoration, survivors of one of the great last stands in the history of British arms. But to understand how a Gloucestershire battalion came to make its stand on that hill, we have to go back. Back to a Britain exhausted by one war and stumbling reluctantly into another. Back to a Labour government counting every penny, to a war office stretched across a shrinking empire, to a Cold War turning suddenly, terrifyingly hot on a peninsula most Britons could not have found on a map. Because the Gloucesters did not choose Hill 235. History and the decisions of men in Whitehall and Washington chose it for them. And what those men decided would leave 700 Gloucestershire soldiers to face the impossible. In the summer of 1950, Britain was a nation worn thin. 5 years had passed since victory over Germany and Japan, but the costs of that triumph still pressed down on every household. Rationing endured: bread, sugar, meat, sweets. The great cities still bore their bomb scars. Clement Attlee's Labour government had built the National Health Service and nationalised the commanding heights of the economy, but it had done so while servicing colossal war debts and managing the orderly retreat of empire. India had gone in 1947. Palestine had been abandoned. The pound had been devalued in 1949. The Treasury watched every shilling, and the chiefs of staff were forever being told that there simply was no money. And yet Britain remained, in her own estimation, and very nearly in fact, a global power. She had the atomic bomb program underway. She held Hong Kong, Malaya, swathes of Africa and the Middle East. She kept the largest navy after the United States. Above all, she clung to the conviction that her voice in the world depended upon the special relationship with Washington, a partnership in which Britain was the senior partner in wisdom, if no longer in power. Then, on June 25th, 1950, the army of Communist North Korea poured across the 38th parallel into the south, and the Cold War became a shooting war. For Attlee and his Foreign Secretary, the formidable Ernest Bevin, the invasion presented a stark calculation. The United States, operating under a United Nations mandate, was committing forces to repel the aggression. If Britain wished to keep her seat at the top table, if she wished to restrain American impetuosity and shape the conduct of the Cold War, she could not stand aside. As Bevin's Foreign Office understood perfectly, influence in Washington had to be paid for in blood and treasure. A purely token contribution would not do. So Britain went to war again. The Royal Navy was committed almost immediately. Then, in August 1950, a hastily assembled brigade was dispatched from Hong Kong. By the winter, a fuller commitment had been agreed. The 29th Independent Infantry Brigade Group, a regular formation stiffened with reservists, many of them men who had fought the Germans only 5 years before and had thought themselves done with war forever. Among the units of the 29th Brigade was the 1st Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment. The Glosters were one of the oldest and proudest infantry regiments in the British Army, tracing their lineage to 1694. They wore a unique distinction, a small badge on the back of their caps, as well as the front, the back badge, won at the Battle of Alexandria in 1801, when the regiment had famously fought back to back against the French. Theirs was a regiment built, quite literally, around the idea of standing firm when surrounded. The symbolism would prove almost unbearably apt. The war they joined had already swung wildly. General Douglas MacArthur's landing at Incheon in September 1950 had routed the North Koreans and carried UN forces deep towards the Chinese border. Then, in November, Communist China intervened with overwhelming force, and the UN line was sent reeling southward in headlong retreat. Seoul fell, was retaken, the front stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel. By the spring of 1951, the 29th Brigade held a sector of the front line astride the Imjin River, north of Seoul, guarding the historic invasion route to the South Korean capital. The men dug in, patrolled, and waited. Intelligence warned of a coming Chinese spring offensive. Nobody quite knew where, or when, or in what strength it would fall. The Gloucesters were about to find out. The man who commanded the Gloucesters was Lieutenant Colonel James Power, Carne, and he was not what Hollywood would have cast. Carne was 44 years old, pipe-smoking, taciturn to the point of silence, a man who could sit for hours saying almost nothing at all. He had served in West Africa and in the war against Japan, and he possessed a quality that would matter enormously in the days to come. An unshakable, almost geological calm. His officers found him hard to read and impossible to rattle. In the chaos that was coming, that calm would become the steel spine of the entire battalion. Carne's brigade commander was Brigadier Tom Brodie, a capable officer who had served with distinction with the Chindits in Burma. Brodie's 29th Brigade was a mixed force. The Glosters, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Ulster Rifles, a Belgian battalion attached for the operation, and crucially, the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars with their Centurion tanks, plus the gunners of 45 Field Regiment Royal Artillery. It was a proper little British fighting formation, but it held a frontage far too wide for its numbers, perhaps 12 miles of broken hill country, with great gaps between the battalions that simply could not be physically held. The Gloucester's position lay on the southern bank of the Imjin, guarding an ancient ford the locals called Gloucester Crossing. Behind them rose a series of hills. Carne placed his rifle companies on the high ground, A, B, C, and D companies dispersed across hilltops with battalion headquarters and the support weapons behind. The arrangement followed sound doctrine, but it meant the companies were separated by valleys and could not always support one another by fire. Against a conventional enemy, the position was strong. Against what was coming, it would prove a scattering of islands in a rising flood. And what was coming was vast. The Chinese Spring Offensive of April 1951 was conceived on an enormous scale. The Chinese commander, Peng Dehuai, intended to shatter the UN line, destroy several divisions, and recapture Seoul in time for May Day. Against the British sector, he hurled the entire 63rd Army of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. 3 divisions, some 27,000 men. Their immediate objective was the road south through the British positions, the direct route to the capital. The Chinese soldier of 1951 has too often been caricatured. In truth, he was tough, disciplined, frugal, and astonishingly mobile. The PVA infantry moved by night, carried their own supplies, and attacked in relentless waves designed to find the seams between enemy units, infiltrate the gaps, and overwhelm by sheer accumulating weight. They had little artillery and almost no air cover, but they had numbers and nerve in abundance. Their tactic was to fix a position frontally whilst flowing around its flanks, cutting it off, and then destroying it at leisure. It was a method ideally suited to the gap-riddled British line. On the morning of April the 22nd, 1951, the Gloucesters sent a patrol forward to Gloucester Crossing. As dusk fell, the men watched the far bank. And then, in the gathering dark, they saw movement. The river, beginning to fill with shadowy figures wading the ford in their hundreds. The patrol's machine guns opened fire, scything into the crossing, and the water churned. But still, they came, and came, and came. The Battle of the Imjin River had begun, and by midnight, the Gloucesters understood they were facing not a raid, but an avalanche. Through the night of April 22nd, the Chinese flood rose around the Gloucesters. A company held a feature called Castle Hill, the forward bastion of the battalion's position. Through the small hours, they fought a desperate close-quarters battle as wave after wave of Chinese infantry stormed the slopes. The fighting was hand-to-hand, grenade against grenade, bayonet against bayonet, the darkness lit by muzzle flashes, and the dreadful glow of burning scrub. By dawn, on April the 23rd, a company had been reduced from roughly 100 men to little more than 50, and the Chinese had gained a foothold on the very crest of Castle Hill. It was here that one of the great acts of valour of the entire war took place. Lieutenant Philip Curtis, ordered to retake a critical bunker that the Chinese had seized, charged it almost single-handed. He was hit, fell, rose again, and pressed on, hurling grenades into the position before he was killed at point-blank range. But the assault he led knocked out the bunker. For this, Curtis would be awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, the first of two the battle would yield. Yet courage could not change arithmetic. By the morning of April the 23rd, a company's position was untenable, and the survivors fell back. The Gloucester's forward line had been breached, and the battalion drew in upon itself. Carne, surveying the wreckage of the night, made the decision that would define the battle. He pulled his surviving companies back and concentrated them on a single dominating feature to the rear. Hill 235, the steep, scrub-covered height that would become Gloucester Hill. It was a sound tactical choice. Concentrated on one hill, the battalion could at last support itself with fire from all sides. The Back Badge Regiment would fight, fittingly, back to back. But it carried a terrible implication. The Gloucesters were now a single isolated knot of resistance, and the Chinese tide had already flowed past them on both flanks, pouring south down the valleys towards Seoul. To hold Hill 235 was to plant a rock in the middle of a river. The water did not stop, it simply went around. Back at brigade headquarters, Brigadier Brodie was wrestling with a crisis along his entire front. The Fusiliers and the Ulster Rifles were themselves heavily engaged and being forced back. Brodie needed to extract his whole brigade before it was destroyed piecemeal. And the Gloucesters, the deepest and most surrounded of his units, were the hardest of all to reach. It was at this point that one of the most famous miscommunications in British military history occurred. Brodie, in the understated idiom of the British officer, signalled to the American Corps headquarters that the Gloucester's situation was a bit sticky. To British ears, a bit sticky meant desperate, critical, on the edge of catastrophe. To the American general receiving it, the phrase sounded like a manageable difficulty, uncomfortable, but hardly an emergency. The true gravity of the Gloucester's plight did not register at corps level until far too late. Whether or not that single understatement changed the outcome, and historians still debate it, the effect was that no overwhelming relief effort was launched in time. By the night of April the 23rd, the Gloucesters were dug in on Hill 235, perhaps 400 men still fit to fight, with the wounded accumulating, ammunition dwindling, and an entire Chinese division gathering in the darkness below them for the kill. And the worst was still to come. The siege of Gloucester Hill lasted through the nights of 23rd, 24th, and into 25th April, and it was a thing of nightmare. The Chinese came at night, as they always did. The men on the hill would hear it begin. The eerie shrilling of whistles, the blare of bugles echoing off the hills, the rhythmic shouting designed to unnerve. Then the flares, then the first ranks rushing up the slopes through their own mortar fire, clambering over the bodies of the men who had fallen in the previous wave. The Gloucesters fought them off with rifle and Bren, gun and grenade. The gunners of 45 Field Regiment dropping shells so close to the British positions that the bursts threw dirt over the defenders. When the Chinese broke through in places, it became a matter of fists, boots, entrenching tools, and bayonets. Each night the perimeter shrank. Each dawn revealed slopes carpeted with the enemy dead, and fewer Gloucesters left to hold the line. Ammunition ran desperately low. Men scavenged rounds from the wounded and the dead. Water was almost gone. The only spring lay outside the perimeter, under enemy fire. The wounded lay in shallow scrapes near the summit, tended by the battalion's medical officer and the regimental padre, Sam Davies, who moved among the dying, offering what comfort he could. Through it all moved Colonel Carne, pipe clenched in his teeth, walking the perimeter with maddening calm, steadying the line by the sheer force of his composure. At one point, in a lull, he reportedly took up a hammer and chisel and carved a small stone Celtic cross. an act of such serene defiance that it has passed into regimental legend. The cross survives to this day in Gloucester Cathedral. By the morning of April the 25th, the situation was beyond retrieval. A relief attempt by a Filipino battalion with tanks had been halted in the valley. A column of the King's Royal Irish Hussars Centurions had tried to batter through and been forced back, their tanks unable to reach the trapped infantry. The hard truth was now official. There would be no rescue. Brigade gave Carne permission for the battalion to attempt its own breakout, every man for himself, in small parties, trying to slip south through the Chinese to the UN lines. It was then that Drum Major Buss played his bugle calls across the valley, that final flourish of defiance. And then the Gloucesters destroyed what they could not carry. The gunners fired their last rounds, and the survivors split into groups and went down off the hill into the encircling enemy. For almost all of them, the breakout failed. The countryside was thick with Chinese troops. Of the parties that set off, only one, D Company, moving south rather than towards the supposed safety of friendly lines, managed to reach the UN front, perhaps 40 men in all. The rest were hunted down, scattered, killed, or rounded up in the hills. Colonel Carne was captured. The Padre was captured. Hundreds of Gloucesters, many of them wounded, were taken prisoner. Of the battalion that had numbered some 700 fighting men days before, only a few dozen answered the roll call behind British lines. The Gloucesters, as a unit, had effectively ceased to exist, but they had held. For 3 days, a single battalion had pinned an entire Chinese division to a hillside, blunting the spearhead aimed at Seoul. The question now was what that sacrifice had bought, and what it had cost. The arithmetic of Gloucester Hill is sobering. The 1st Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment, suffered something close to total destruction as a fighting force. Of roughly 700 men engaged, around 50 were killed and over 500 taken prisoner, many of them wounded. Only a small remnant escaped to friendly lines. Across the whole of the 29th Brigade, the Imjin battle cost more than 1,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing in just a few days of fighting. It was the most severe loss suffered by a British brigade since the Second World War, and it remains one of the bloodiest single actions in the post-war history of the British Army. What had Britain gained for this fearful price? The strategic answer is that the 29th Brigade, and the Gloucesters above all, had blunted and delayed the main thrust of the Chinese 63rd Army at the very point where it aimed to break through to Seoul. By forcing the Chinese to halt and grind down a stubborn British defence rather than flow freely southward, the brigade bought precious time for the rest of the UN line to fall back in good order and reform. The Chinese offensive faltered short of its objective. Seoul did not fall. Peng Dehuai's Mayday prize slipped from his grasp. The Chinese 63rd Army was so badly mauled in the process that it had to be withdrawn from the line to refit. The Gloucesters had been sacrificed, but not wasted. For those taken prisoner, however, the ordeal was only beginning. The survivors faced a grueling forced march northward to the prison camps along the Yalu River, the wounded suffering terribly along the way. They would remain in captivity for 2 years until the armistice of 1953, subjected to cold, hunger, disease, and the relentless re-education pressure of their captors. Colonel Carne endured long periods of solitary confinement and harsh treatment for his refusal to cooperate. He kept his faith and his composure throughout, and when he was finally released, he brought home that little stone cross he had carved on the hill. In London, the news of the Gloucesters' stand landed in a particular political moment. Attlee's government was tottering, beset by the strain of rearmament. the very rearmament that Korea had forced upon a treasury that could ill afford it. The cost of the war effort had, only weeks earlier, helped split the Labour Party when Anyurin Bevan resigned over the imposition of NHS charges to fund defence spending. Korea was already proving politically corrosive at home. Yet the heroism of the Gloucesters offered something the exhausted nation badly needed: a tale of pure, old-fashioned courage that seemed to reach back to the regiment's most glorious traditions. There was, too, a harder military lesson. The Imjin battle exposed the dangers of holding too wide a frontage with too few men, of dispersing companies on separate hilltops where they could not support one another, and, in that fatal phrase, a bit sticky, of the gulf in idiom and understanding that could open up between British and American command. The British Army would absorb these lessons, but it absorbed them at the cost of a battalion. Carne would receive the Victoria Cross for his leadership on the hill. A second VC went, posthumously, to Lieutenant Curtis for Castle Hill. The Gloucesters had earned a place in history. The question was what that place would mean for the regiment, for the army, and for Britain's standing in the dangerous new world of the Cold War. In the immediate aftermath, the Gloucesters' stand became something rare in the grim accountancy of the Korean War, a story of unambiguous glory. The Americans, whose corps the brigade had been fighting under, awarded the 1st Battalion the United States Distinguished Unit Citation, a signal honor, and won the Gloucesters' war with pride ever after on a distinctive badge. For a British regiment to receive such an American decoration was in itself a small monument to the special relationship that Bevan and Attlee had been so determined to nurture through blood. Britain had paid in the only currency Washington truly respected, and Washington had acknowledged the debt. When the prisoners came home in 1953, after the armistice, they returned to a hero's welcome. Carne, freed at last, was received as a national figure. His Victoria Cross and his quiet, unbreakable conduct in captivity made him the very model of British understatement under pressure. The little stone cross he had carved was placed in Gloucester Cathedral, and the regiment thereafter marked the anniversary of the battle each year. The Glorious Glosters entered the language. Strategically, Korea settled into a long, grinding stalemate along roughly the line where it had begun, near the 38th parallel. The front stabilized. The fighting became a matter of patrols and positional warfare around hills with names like the Hook, and the war dragged on until the armistice of July 1953. An armistice, not a peace, which left the peninsula divided to this day. Britain kept her Commonwealth division in the line throughout, fighting hard and well, but the Imjin remained the defining British action of the war. For British strategy, Korea taught a sober lesson about the new shape of the world. Britain had gone to war to preserve her influence in Washington and to demonstrate her value as America's principal ally. In that narrow aim, she had succeeded. The contribution was noticed, the special relationship reaffirmed. But the war had also laid bare an uncomfortable truth. Britain could no longer set the terms of such conflicts. She fought under American command on a battlefield chosen by others for objectives shaped in Washington. The senior partner in wisdom was, increasingly and undeniably, the junior partner in power. The rearmament that Korea forced upon Britain strained the post-war economy badly and contributed to the fall of Attlee's government in October 1951, bringing Churchill back to Downing Street for his Indian summer premiership. The defence burden that Korea imposed would shape British economic and strategic debate for years. The perennial argument between commitments and resources that would run through Suez, through the retreat from east of Suez under Wilson and beyond. And there was a deeper resonance. The Gloucester's stand was, in a sense, one of the last battles in a very old British tradition. The isolated regiment, the impossible odds, the line that holds. Rorke's Drift, the squares at Waterloo, the back-to-back fight at Alexandria from which the regiment drew its very badge. Gloucester Hill belonged to that lineage, but it was fought in a new kind of war, a limited war, a Cold War proxy conflict in which total victory was never the aim, and the enemy was an idea as much as an army. The old courage met the new strategy on that hillside, and both, in their way, were vindicated. For the men who had been there, of course, the larger meanings mattered less than the simple, terrible facts. The friends lost on the slopes, the 2 years behind the wire, the bugle calls in the dark. They had been asked to do the impossible, and they had nearly done it. What remained was to ensure they were not forgotten. Today, Hill 235 still rises above the Korean countryside, and there is a memorial there to the men who held it. In Gloucestershire, the regiment's successors keep the memory alive. The Soldiers of Gloucestershire Museum tells the story, and in Gloucester Cathedral, Carne's small stone cross still stands, a fragment of a hilltop carried home from the far side of the world. What does the stand at the Imjin tell us about Britain's place in the world? It tells us, first, that the post-war retreat from imperial power was never a simple slide into irrelevance. Even diminished, even exhausted, even counting her pennies, Britain still chose to fight. And her soldiers, when they fought as well as any in their long history. The Gloucesters on Hill. 235 were not the army of a great empire at its zenith. They were the army of a tired, indebted island that had decided, for hard-headed reasons of state, that her voice in the world was worth paying for in blood. There is something both noble and melancholy in that. It tells us, too, about the peculiar British genius for the last stand, and about its limits. The Gloucesters held magnificently, but they were not relieved, and most of them ended the battle dead or in captivity. Heroism is not the same as victory, and a stand bought with a battalion is a costly way to buy time. The Imjin sits at the meeting point of two truths the British have always found hard to reconcile: the romance of the gallant few and the cold arithmetic of strategy. Both are real. Both were present on that hill. And it tells us something about alliance. Britain fought in Korea to stay close to America, and the price of that closeness was Gloucester Hill and 1,000 other casualties. The special relationship was not a sentiment. It was a transaction, sealed in the currency of shared sacrifice, and the men of the 29th Brigade paid an instalment on it with their lives. Every British soldier who has fought alongside the Americans since, from the Gulf to Helmand, walks in some sense in their footsteps. 7 decades on, the bugle calls have faded, the wire camps are gone, and the survivors have nearly all passed into history. But the question they answered with their bodies still echoes: what is a nation willing to spend, and where, and for what, to keep its place in the world? The Gloucesters did not get to choose. They were handed a hill and told to hold it, and they held it until there was almost nothing left to hold with. That, perhaps, is the truest definition of duty there is. So, what do you make of it? Was the Gloucesters' stand a magnificent vindication of British arms, or a tragedy of poor positioning, and a misunderstood signal that cost a battalion its existence? Was Korea a war worth fighting for Britain at all, or a bill we paid simply to keep our seat beside the Americans? I'd genuinely like to know where you come down, so tell me in the comments below. If this story moved you, if you think the men of Gloucester Hill deserve to be remembered, then do please give this video a like and subscribe for more forgotten corners of Britain's military past. We'll be back on that hard ground again soon. Until then, thank you for watching.